let's start with your first memory of comics, getting into comic books. What drew you to comic books?
I don't remember when I wasn't reading comic books. I tell people that when I was born and the doctor slapped me, I dropped a copy of Walt Disney's Comics and Stories. I was reading them at a very early age. When I was very, very young, I was reading, before I even got to kindergarten, I was reading Dr. Seuss books and comic books and various children's books. And I had the reading level comprehension of like a fourth grader when I was in kindergarten. And I attributed that to the comic books and to Dr. Seuss as well. He gets the credit. My parents always bought me lots of comic books. I always had more comic books than anyone else I knew. I probably have more comic books than anyone watching this video at the moment. I probably have more comic books than everybody collectively who will watch this video. But I can't tell you when I didn't have them.
Was there a certain genre, something that really drew you at an early age?
Early on,
comics?
Yeah. Early on, it was the comic books with the characters I knew from television, the Disney comics, the Warner Brothers comics. I read a lot of the Western Publishing Dell comics. There's a story I tell people a lot, which is absolutely true. The very first movie that I ever remember seeing, I mean, my parents took me to movies when I was 4 and 3, I don't remember those. But the first time I was ever conscious, I was seeing a movie and understanding what it was about, was a movie called Don't Give Up the Ship, starring Jerry Lewis in 1959, which I saw at the Paradise Theater on Sepulveda Boulevard, right near LAX. And the next day, I had a pediatrician's appointment. My parents bought me a bunch of comic books. They took me to stand on the way and let me buy a bunch of comic books. And one of the comic books I bought was the Dell Comics movie adaptation of Don't Give Up the Ship. So I'm sitting in the office of Dr. Arthur Grossman, my pediatrician, on Wilshire Boulevard in Beverly Hills, and I read my comic books. I had the comic book of Don't Give Up the Ship there. I'm following the story that I just saw yesterday on the screen. And then I'm waiting for my parents to come back and pick me up, and there's a kid waiting for his parents to come pick him up. And he turns to me and he says, "You see that movie?" And I said, "Yeah, it was real neat." And he said, "That's my dad." And I pointed the cover. I said, "Your dad is Jerry Lewis?" He said, "Yeah, that's my dad." And I was just about to, call the kid a liar, and Jerry Lewis walked in. And he was enormously rude to me. I went, "Oh, Mr. Lewis, I got your comic book." And he didn't, and I didn't bother me that much because I figured, well, that's what Jerry Lewis acts like, So the punchlines to that story are, number one, years later, I was writing variety shows, and Jerry Lewis was a guest on them. So the first time I worked with them, actually, they flew me to Vegas to meet with him. I took along the comic book. Not a copy of the comic book, the exact same one I was holding in the doctor's office that day. And I made him sign it, and he apologized to me for how he'd acted. And the other punchline to that is that comic book was drawn, I didn't know the name at the time, by a man named Dan Siegel. When I started writing comic books, Dan Siegel started drawing a lot of the ones I did. We became very good friends, and I worked together with Dan more than any other artist I worked with in my career, with the possible exception of Sergio Aragonis. And Dan and I are still good friends, and so there's that kind of arc where my professional career kind of buttoned this little childhood memory of being 9 years old, being 7 years old. 7 years old I was at the time, and having Jerry Lewis tell me to get out of his way.
That's a quick turnaround. Were the Dell adaptations usually out at the same time?
Frequently, yeah. They would. They would do the comic book at the time the movie was in production. Sometimes Dan, if it was drawing them from the script and a few stills of the actors, he had usually not seen the movie. And sometimes he didn't have much reference at all. But yeah, they would try to get the comic book out at the same time because the publicity of the movie would help sell the comic book and so on. I even remember thinking how odd it was that here's Jerry Lewis in a Dell comic book, and Jerry Lewis was the star of a DC comic book at the time. It was the Jerry Lewis comic book. And I kept thinking, gee, doesn't DC Comics have the rights to Jerry Lewis? And I mean, it was just very confusing.
How old were you?
I was 7.
That's quite a lot.
I thought about this kind of stuff when I was 7.
That's amazing.
That's why this is going to be such a boring interview.
I think it's fascinating. I think so far it's great. Is this Gary Lewis? Is this
no, this was the other one. Yeah, this is the younger, slightly younger than me. Although I met Gary and I told him the story. And went, yeah, my dad did that all the time.
So early on, obviously, your parents were very supportive. Were they artistic? Were they?
No, not at all. My father had the worst job in the world. He worked for the Internal Revenue Service. It was a job that he took for a short period of time to like, oh, I'll just take this to make rent while I get a real job. And then my mother became pregnant, and he never found another job. He hated the job. He had at one point in his life entertained the idea of trying to be a comedy writer early on. And he had made one submission in his life. The guy rejected it, and my father was so crushed he never tried again. And when I started making noises at around age 9 that I was going to be a professional writer, and that's literally how early it was, he started saying to me, oh, they'll break your heart. They'll say cruel things. They'll just, it's such a heartless business. And I went, okay, well, what is it? So I didn't let that dissuade me, but the only artistic influence in the family was that this one aspiration my father had, which he never realized.
So when you were growing up, I mean, obviously you were collecting comics.
Collecting comics incessantly.
When I talked to Scott, we talked about how we didn't have this collector's culture that we have now. No Antiques Roadshow, no eBay. So comics and maybe baseball cards were what kids collected, and serious collectors collected stamps and coins. But did you find yourself collecting, or is it just, I just have to have I can get my hands on?
Yes, I had to have any comic I could get my hands on. But what it was like, I really liked reading them. I liked watching the cartoons on TV also. To me, Huckleberry Hound was on see, this is an experience kids don't have today. Huckleberry Hound, when I was a kid, was on half an hour a week. There was no way to see Huckleberry Hound any other place. There were no VCRs, there was no reruns. It was on, so you only got a half an hour of Huckleberry Hound in your life. So the only way to experience Huckleberry Hound, except for that 1/2 hour a week, was the comic book. So I had all the Huckleberry Hound comic books, and I could read them anytime I wanted to. And I had all these comics, and I liked the stories, and I liked the artwork. I liked the fact you could see a story being told. And I liked, one of the things I liked about the Funny Animal comic books, which was never present in the superhero comics, and there's a very interesting thing about this, is that to me, the Funny Animal comics had soundtracks. I knew what Yogi Bear sounded like. I knew what Donald Duck sounded like. I knew what Bugs Bunny sounded like. Superman and Batman didn't have voices like that. And the same thing happened, I realized later when I was writing them in the 70s. When I was writing Yogi Bear, I could imagine Dawes Butler doing the voice of Yogi Bear. In fact, I could even take the comic books when they were printed over to Dawes' house and he'd read them aloud for me. We did that. But when I was writing like a Superman comic book or something like that, there was no voice. I could imagine George Reeves, or I could imagine Christopher Reeve, or Kirk Allen, or whoever I wanted, or Bud Collyer, but that wasn't the definitive Superman. There was no definitive Superman voice the way there was with Bugs Bunny.
Now, you grew up in Southern California.
West Los Angeles.
And obviously you're the same pediatrician as Jerry Lewis.
Yeah.
I mean, did you feel like the film industry was something that you were around, or?
A little bit. Our next door neighbor in the house that I grew up in, and which I lived in, I still own that house. My mother just passed away. I still own that same house. She lived it until she died. Was a woman named Betty Lynn, who played Thelma Lou on the Andy Griffith Show. And before that, she played the wife on the Texas John Slaughter series for Disney, the Western show. Before that, she was on the Ray Milland Show. Before that, she was a contract star at 20th Century Fox, and she was in all the Fred MacMurray movies and all of the Reddy Young movies. But she wasn't a movie or TV star. She was my crazy Aunt Betty next door. She was just a lovely, wonderful neighbor friend. But we occasionally would meet people in show business and so on. And actually, one of the things that was kind of odd is my father, as an Internal Revenue agent, would occasionally have cases against people in show business. My father's position at the IRS was you had to be in a lot of trouble before you met my father. He was the one who came to you and negotiated a payment plan for the fact that you hadn't paid your taxes since the Coolidge administration. And people then generally hated my father because he had this terrible, awful job. That's why he hated it. He hated what he was doing to people. He hated the way the government was treating them through him. He would negotiate with you, well, you're going to pay $50 a week, And then he'd go back, and his boss would say, "No, get 85 from him." And he had to come back to you and say, "I'm sorry, you've got to give me 85 a week." And they would hate him as the messenger. But he had, every so often, I run down to somebody he had a case on years ago, and I'll be introduced, and they'll go, "Evanier, where do I know that name from?" I'll go, "Oh, it's a common name. There's thousands of us around. There's like 4 of us, you know." But I don't want them to connect me with the fact that my father threatened to take their house away.
That's funny. The early fandom, the people who got together that started ComicCon, there is a lot of overlap between like the sci-fi crowd and the film crowd, and those aspects have always been part of fandom.
Yeah, in the '60s there were more of these sharp dividing lines. There was this group in, I guess it still exists, called LASFS, the Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society, and we had a comic book club, which I was the president of, the local comic book club, and the guys from LASFS were so snotty towards the comic fans. It was, I mean, some of them since become friends of mine, and they're embarrassed by that, but it was this whole, "Oh, we're science fiction fans, we're better than comic fans." And this was like the year before all the science fiction fans were suddenly running around with Star Trek ears on and you know, toy phasers and stuff. And we suddenly had the maturity high ground. But there was, in LA, there was film fandom, and there was science fiction fandom, and there was comic fandom, and there were these sharp dividing lines. I was invited to a LASFS meeting at one point, and they said to me, "Now remember, you're not allowed to talk about comic books in here." And I went, "I'm not going. Forget it." If you're so, you would think that science fiction fans would be the last one to fault somebody for their interest in something, you know, bizarre or something fantastic. You know, but that exists, and fortunately, haven't seen any of that in 30 years. But there was those little caste systems going on.
Now, you're graduating from high school in
'69.
'69. You're pretty much a pro in '69, aren't you? I mean, are you working as an assistant for Kirby at that
Well,
point?
it happened. I graduated high school in 1960. Oh, by the way, to partly finish your questions, I went to school with a lot of kids who were. I went to school with Burt Lancaster's daughter. I went to school with Alan Sherman's son. I went to school with David Cassidy, was a class ahead of me. Bonnie Raitt was in my class. Now, Bonnie Raitt, wonderful singer. She was a year older than me when I graduated high school, and her official bio now has her, she's 6 years younger than me. I don't understand how this works. Deborah Raffin was in my class. We had a lot of stars, or a lot of people whose parents were in the business. My favorite movie of all time probably was It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. Stanley Kramer, the director, his son was in my class. And I pestered his son to death with, "Would you ask your father if in this scene Buddy Hackett was moving that," you know, things like that. So we had that kind of content. And then, like, when I was about 11, Betty Lynn took me on the set of the Andy Griffith Show. And she took me, I went to Mayberry. It was on the Paramount lot, but I went to Mayberry, and I played handball with Ron Howard, and I met Don Knotts, and I later on worked with these people professionally, and Howie Morris was there. Like that. And then in one of my seminal experiences, I have 4 or 5 things which I look back on and go, "Oh, there's my life changed that day." I went to a filming in 1961 or 62, I guess, 62, I think, of the Dick Van Dyke Show. And I was too young to get in, but I'd met Maury Amsterdam in the airport, and he invited me as his special guest. Mr. Amsterdam, I love the Dick Van Dyke Show. He says, "Yeah, you really want to come see us film it sometime? Here, okay, call this number." And I went, and he wasn't in the show that week. That was the other fun. He said, "I'll give you a tour. I'll introduce you to everybody." And he wasn't there that week. We went. But I got to see a TV show, my favorite TV show at the time, filmed live. I talked a little to Dick Van Dyke there. I got to see Mary Tyler Moore in person. There is no person, place, or thing in the world that I will ever think is as beautiful as Mary Tyler Moore was. I know she was like 24 or something like that at the time. She was in color, the first time I'd ever seen her in color. In person, she was 3 feet from me, and I was kind of, making that Jackie Gleason hamana, hamana, hamana sound the whole time. And I said to myself at that point, I want to be in this world. I don't know, at that point I already thought I wanted to be a writer, and I figured out that those 2 guys over there wearing the sweaters were the writers, Persky and Denoff, Sam Sam Danoff and Bill Persky. I figured out that they were them. I thought, oh, I want to be those guys. And because they belonged here, they had a function. I didn't want to be a performer. I wanted to be around that. And then you jump forward years later, I was story editing TV shows, and one day I was on the set, when we were taping. I looked at the studio audience, and I suddenly realized, oh, here I am. There's a kid up there looking down and saying, oh, I want to be that guy, except I want to be better dressed than that. But so I had all those little things. Now in '69, when I got out of high school, I knew I wanted to be a professional writer. To that point, I'd written things for fanzines. I'd actually had a couple of I'd been writing letters to comic books and having them printed. I had a very high percentage of the letters I wrote to comic books printed. And I was very proud of that until I saw the quality of letters that comic books get and realized that, that it was not hard to pick from the pile of the 3 or 4 printable ones. And 3 different editors that I was writing letters to had asked me to submit comic book stories to them. And I'd written scripts that in each case were accepted but not bought. It was like, oh, we want to buy this story. And then the editor would be fired before he could consummate the deal. That literally happened to me 3 times. So I was like as close as you can get to being a professional without actually having received a check. A week after my graduation, I said, it's time for me to try to become a real professional writer. So I went to I had this idea, having just dealt with these editors by mail and having the frustration of like the letter comes in the mail and it's not something you can respond to or have a dialogue with. I thought, I want an editor I can talk to. I want to work for somebody in LA so I can sit across the desk and say, why did you not like this, or why did you? I wanted to learn from it.
Not to interrupt you, but you're sending these to New York at this point. So you're getting these.
The DC things were the comics were in New York.
Okay.
I wanted an editor in LA.
I got you. Okay.
So I went to the newsstand, the one at Cahuenga and Hollywood, where the big comic book rack was. I spent an hour just looking at magazines and seeing what's published in Los Angeles. And I discovered that Lapins magazine, based on this then current TV show, was done in LA. In fact, it was done within walking distance of that newsstand. So I went home, I wrote 3 or 4 articles, I think I wrote about 8 articles in one night that could fit for Lapins magazine, that fit its format. The next day I took the bus up to Hollywood. I went to the offices of Lawford Publishing Company at 1818 North Highland. I remember all this stuff. And I said to the secretary, hi, I'm a young struggling comedy writer. I'd like to speak to the editor. And she went, oh, okay. There's a young struggling comedy writer here to see you. And he said, tell him if he comes back in an hour, I'll give him all the time he wants. So I said, fine. Went off, got a slice of pizza, came back, and I walked out of the office with a check for $900. He bought 3 of the articles for $300 a piece. I went, oh, okay, that's fine. My father was making $380 a week at this point. And I was a professional writer. Wow. I've never been out of work since then. I've always been writing stuff. Every morning I've got something I can wake up to and write and know I'm going to be paid for it.
That's amazing. And you're just a couple of months out of high school.
I was 2 weeks out of high school.
2 weeks.
I was probably less than 2 weeks. It was probably about 10 days. And then about a week later, the guys in our comic book club went to a science fiction convention. There were no comic conventions in LA at the point. This is July of 1970. The first ComicCon was 3 months off. Yeah, July, right. And a guy in our comic club went to a convention, a WesterCon, at the Miramar Hotel in Santa Monica. I did not go because A, I was finding science fiction fans very snotty, as just described, and B, the girl, my girlfriend at the time was leaving town, and she made me an offer. Oh, we could go up to Malibu for the day and spend the night up there. I went, that's a lot better than going to a science fiction convention. So I didn't go to the convention. Jack Kirby did, and at this point, most of the guys in our club had never met a guy someone who actually did comic books, let alone meet Jack Kirby, the guy who did all their favorites. I had actually met, to this point, I had met Bob Kane, I had met Jerry Siegel, I had met 1 or 2 other guys who did comic books. But our officers of our club, sans me, got invited to the Kirby home, which at that time Jack was living in Irvine, California. And the following Tuesday, I went along with them to meet Jack Kirby and began working for him a couple months later. But in the meantime, there was a thing called Marvel Mania International, which was the Marvel fan club. It was a company that had licensed the right to run a Marvel fan club. This is as you will understand here, my life abounds in odd coincidences. All right. Remember, I told you that the Lapins magazine was like within walking distance of the newsstand. Well, okay. I didn't drive. I took my friends were going to summer school at Hamilton High School, so the idea was I would take the bus down to Hamilton, meet them there, and the mother of one of them would pick us up there and take us all down to Irvine. So I take the bus down to Pico and Robertson and go to the newsstand to buy the new comics that have come out that day. It's the first of the month's Marvels. So they have all the new ads for the month. And in there is the first ad for Marvel Mania International. And I open up, oh my goodness, Marvel's got an office in LA. Marvel's Comics is here now somehow. And the address was in Culver City, like only 3 or 4 miles from where I was. So on a whim, I went to a payphone and I called directory assistance. I asked for the number of Marvel Mania International. They gave it to me. I called the office. A man answered, and I said, "Oh, I'm the president of the local comic club. We want to find out all about your organization." He said, "Oh, great, come by. Come visit us right now. Come out of our offices right this minute." And their offices were 4 blocks from where I was. And I said, "I'm on my way to meet Jack Kirby in Irvine." He said, "Oh, give Jack my best and come by tomorrow." So we drove down to the Kirby family. I spent the whole day with Jack. Got to meet him. Lovely man. He was so nice to us. While we were there, Stan Lee phoned, and they talked about the next issue of Fantastic Four on the phone. And I had brought down some of the fanzines I'd written. I was going to leave them for Jack. I did, but at one point he said, "Hey, this looks like interesting. Here, I want to read this. Roz, take them on a tour of the house." And Jack sat down and started reading this article I'd written while Roz showed us around the rest of the house. I hadn't intended Jack to read this story in front of me. But he read this article I wrote, and he goes, "That's great. That's terrific. You can really write, young man." And my friends had told him I was an artist, which I was by 17-year-old standards. I never got much better. And Jack said, "Here, finish this panel for me." He had a page of Fantastic Four on the drawing table that was almost done. He had drawn a figure, but there was no hand on it. The figure had no hand on it. He hadn't drawn the hand on it yet. He said, Here, draw the hand on it." And I said, "But I'm not good enough to draw to help the worst Marvel artist, let alone Jack Kirby." And he insisted. And I thought, I'm going to destroy a Jack Kirby page. And I thought, maybe A, Joe Sennet's going to ink it, and B, Jack's got an eraser. So I drew it real lightly, and he goes, "Great, terrific." And it was his way of making me a part of comics, so I could feel like I was a part of comics. So the next day, I went to the Marvel Mania offices. And Jack had said to me, "Oh, those guys know what they're doing. They need someone like you to tell them how to work the business. They don't know the comics." See, I knew the comics. He was impressed with the fact that I knew not just what the other name of Puppet Master was, but that I knew who inked what, or who wrote what, or who lettered this, which was just one of my obsessions. I was just interested in that, and I was. And that he would mention a name. He'd tell us a story about, and Bill Everett, and I knew who that was, or Martin Goodman, and I knew who that was. I was actually like annotating his stories for my friends. Jack would say, start telling us a story about, so Carl Burgos was doing this, and he wouldn't stop to tell us who Carl Burgos was. And my friends would look blank, and I go, "Oh, he did the first Human Torch stories. Oh, okay." So I walked into Marvel Mania, and Jack, the guy there, said, "Jack thinks we should hire you." He called up that morning and said, "Grab this kid. He knows the comics backwards and forwards." And I started working for Marvel Mania. So, and then a couple months later, Jack left Marvel. I went to DC, and he asked me to be his assistant, and also a fellow named Steve Sherman, who also worked at Marvel Mania. And I was selling stuff to magazines and like that. And then a few months after that, I started writing comic books for Disney. And a few months after that, I started writing comic books for Gold Key. For Disney, I was writing foreign Disney comics. For Gold Key, I was writing the American Disney comics, and then that led to the American Bugs Bunny comics and the American Hanna-Barbera comics.
Now, Gold Key was based in L.A.
Gold Key had offices in both New York and Los Angeles. They had half the line from each.
And Disney's foreign division?
Disney's foreign were out of the Disney lot. While I was working for Disney Foreign Comics, once a week I would take the bus out to Burbank, and I'd get there at like 10 o'clock, 10:30, and I'd visit the editors there, and they'd take me around, and they'd introduce me to people, and I picked up a few writing jobs for other Disney projects on the lot. And then I'd have lunch with them, and I'd leave. And when I left, I would go over to NBC Burbank, and I would either sneak in. Usually I had a way to legally get in, but if I didn't, I'd sneak in. Or sometimes I'd sneak in even if I had a legal way to get in because it was fun. And I'd walk around NBC Burbank, and I'd go into stage 3 where Bob Hope was taping a show, or Rowan Martin's Lapins was taping in there. Or I'd go into stage 1 where Bob Hope might be, or if he was in town, Johnny Carson would be doing the Tonight Show. Or I'd go down to stage 5 where Dean Martin's show was rehearsing. Or this was, or there were game shows there. And you could run into everybody in show business in that building. And I'd go watch Johnny Carson do his monologue, or I'd watch Bob Hope tape a special, or I'd watch, Lapin do the party scene, or things like that. And that was another big part of I spent a whole day with Gene Kelly there.
How'd that go?
Gene Kelly was doing a show called The Funny Side. It was it was a variety show on NBC. It was on for about 4.5 minutes before they canceled it. Created by Persky and Denoff, the same guys in the Dick Van Dyke Show. And I was having lunch in the Disney commissary, and with a man named George Sherman, who was my editor at the Disney lot. And Gene Kelly came by and said hello to George Sherman. He introduced me. And he was doing The Funny Side across the street. And he'd stopped in the Disney lot for a meeting with somebody. And I said, I like The Funny Side. He said, come over and watch us tape it. So I went over right after lunch, and I went to the Funny Side set, and I was there. And Kelly took me in. They were taping stuff he wasn't involved in. So he was sitting in the bleachers in a tuxedo, looking like Gene Kelly. And I sat in the bleachers with him for like 3 hours, asking him stories about MGM and about his career, and him telling me, he spent a good 15, 20 minutes telling me when he directed Hello Dolly, the movie of Hello Dolly, how much Barbra Streisand and Walter Matthau hated each other. And then, just at the end of it's 5 or 6 o'clock, when the taping was over, I was going to say goodbye. He said, hey, listen, you want to come down? I'm doing the Dean Martin show tonight. I'm taping So I went, okay, and I went down with him to the Dean Martin show and hung out backstage with him the whole time and met everybody except Dean, because you couldn't meet Dean. Anyway, so that was a...
I want to get back to something that you'd said earlier. Now, you'd said that this was all before Comic Cons, that you met Bob Kane and Jerry Siegel. How did you meet those guys?
Well, let's see. I met the first comic book artist I ever met. I don't tell people his name because it was very obscure, and because I wrote an article about what an idiot he was. But his son went to school with me. His son was a comic book artist, and his son was in my class. And at some point, he said to me, "Oh, my dad does comic books." And I went, "Really? Can I meet him?" And I went over and met the guy and talked to him for a day. And he told me, "Oh, this is a rotten business. Everybody screws everybody else. You got to knife them in the back before they get you, because they're all crooks. They're all liars." And he started telling me how every editor was a scumbag who took kickbacks and cheated on his wife. He mentioned, you could not mention an editor without him telling you, he cheated on his wife. And I go, like that. I mean, I'm not saying that's a commendable thing, but there are worse things in this world than cheating on your wife. Anyway, not to him. And so, and then he later on told me he was cheating on his wife. So anyway, but we had this comic book club, as I mentioned, and we met at a park, Palms Park on Overland Avenue. And the lady there who ran the park director, insisted we have a fundraiser event every year. We didn't need funds. We collected dues. We had nothing to do with the money except screw around with it and have fun with it. I mean, we didn't need money, but she insisted we have a fundraising event, and she wanted us to have a car wash, and we didn't want to wash cars. So we said, let's do a thing. We invented this thing called the Evening of Imagination. We took over the park for an evening. Usually, I think it was a Saturday evening. And we just we turned the park into a comic book fantasy museum. We brought 8mm Charlie Chaplin films in one room. We had old Orson Welles radio shows in another room. We took the display cases. We took all the awards out of the display cases and put in rare comic books from our collection. And we had little panel discussions about the history of comics. And it was kind of like, come and pay $1 and visit the comic book museum. And we did this twice, and I think the second time we get this call, the assistant park director calls me and says, the thing you're doing tomorrow night with the Evening Imagination thing, we've gotten a couple calls from people who want to come and see it. They want to make sure it's the time it starts. And one of them said he was Jerry Siegel, creator of Superman. And I thought, this has got to be like a joke, right? You know, yeah, okay, yeah, fine. So our members all know that Jerry Siegel is allegedly coming. And
what year is it?
This is 1967. 67, I think. And it's like, is Jerry Siegel really going to show up? Is Jerry Siegel not going to show up? And just then one of our members runs in and goes, oh my God, Jerry Siegel's here. I said, really? He says, yeah, I saw this man. It's got to be Jerry Siegel. He's in the next room. He's looking at the exhibits. That's got to be Jerry Siegel. Mark, you go up and introduce yourself to him because you're the president. You welcome him. I go, I can't talk to Jerry. What am I going to say? How am I going to address Jerry Siegel, the creator of Superman? And I was like petrified. And they go, no, go in and you know, and they shove me. You've got to go in. So I walk in, and the man that they were thinking was Jerry Siegel was not Jerry Siegel. It was my father. So I showed him around a little bit, you know, and just then this other man tapped me on the shoulder and says, hi, are you the president of this group? And yeah, I am. He said, oh, I'm Jerry Siegel. And I looked, it was Jerry Siegel. And he'd come by to visit. He paid admission, gave us $1, whatever we were charging. And he was charming. We talked for a while, and he invited me over to his apartment, which was 2 blocks from my high school. Everything in my life is right near each other. And I spent an afternoon with Jerry Siegel. Now, in the meantime, shortly after this, one of our members was shopping at the comic book rack at the food giant on Westwood Boulevard. I don't know why I'm telling you the geography of this. It's not there anymore. And he's at the rack, and this man comes up to him and says, yeah, you like Batman? And the kid says, yeah, thinking, the kid thinks I'm about to be hit on by, you know, some pervert, you know, and the man says, I'm Bob Kane, the creator of Batman. And he was. And he invited the club members. He said, get some of your club members to come up to my place. So a couple of days later, we went over to visit Bob Kane, and we spent an afternoon with him. And as with Jack Kirby, he was impressed by what I knew about the comics in a different way. Because what it was with Bob Kane, when it was Jack Kirby, who I met later, if I said that if he mentioned something and I added in detail, he was really impressed. But Bob Kane would say to me, oh yeah, I was drawing this, I was up all night drawing that comic. And I'd say, didn't Carmen Infantino draw that comic? He'd go, yeah, all right, yeah. He assisted me on that, which was a lie. But and he kept, and throughout the afternoon, I could feel him switch from the bullshit stories he told most people to, I better be accurate with this kid here. So then he says to me, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to be a writer. And at that point, I'd been writing a few things and submitting to DC at the request of editors. He said, come see me on your own. Why don't you come and pay a special visit to me? So I went back a couple of days later. He sat me down. He started pouring himself some vodka. And he told me the history of the comics according to Bob Kane, culminating with him asking me to ghost work for him, just show him some of my samples, because maybe I could do some work for him. And I had started to figure out, this guy doesn't do his own artwork. He doesn't do his own writing. He just hires people and fronts it. So I thought, okay, so I'll give it a try. So I sent him some things I'd written, some things I'd drawn. And Bob Kane told me I had no talent whatsoever and should forget the whole business. And I thought to myself, it's Bob Kane, what does he know? I just ignored it. It didn't dissuade me one bit. And so that's how I met this other guy. I tell people I met Jerry Siegel, Bob Kane, and Jack Kirby, the co-creator of Superman, the co-creator of Batman, and the co-creator of everything else. And that's, I've now taken you up to about just before the first San Diego Con.
You know, I do have a question before we get to that, because you were sending samples out of your writing.
Yeah.
And I hear the names of Maury Amsterdam and Alan Sherman, and I mean, you're very, you're into these comics.
I remember everything.
What were the stories that you were sending out? Were they funny stories?
What you mean the stories I was submitting to?
Yeah, submitting to DC.
Well, what happened with DC was very simply, I was writing letters to editors, and one day Mort Weisinger, who was the editor of the Superman books, wrote me a note and said, "Your letters are very perceptive. Have you ever considered writing? We could use summaries of some plot ideas. If you want to set up, I buy plot ideas for $10 a piece. If you have an plot idea for a Superman story." So I sent him a couple and didn't hear from him for a while. And then he wrote back to me mysteriously and said, "Listen, I don't really want plot ideas. If you want to write a script, I'll look at it and I might very well buy it because I need new writers." And I later figured out that what was happening was that at DC at that moment, there was this little drive from a number of the seasoned writers. They were kind of forming a loose union and kind of demanding health insurance and reprint fees. And Weisinger was kind of, I think, poised to, I may have to fire all my writers any day now. I better line up some other people. And so I sat down and I wrote a Jimmy Olsen story. And I don't know why I did this. I wrote like a 25-page Jimmy. A beginner should start with like a 6-pager or an 8-pager. I wrote a 25-page Jimmy Olsen story, which is amazing. It should be in a comic museum because you never see anyone make every single possible mistake in one story. And it was just, I look back and I can't believe I wrote that stuff. I read it a couple times years later and I thought, what was I thinking? It was such a stupid story. And Weisinger took this time to go through it, and he didn't write a lot, but he wrote like 3 words here and 8 words here. This doesn't make sense. This isn't, and they were very perceptive critics. Now I later on heard, for other people suggested that he hadn't written those, that his assistant Nelson Bridwell had, and I could almost buy that more because Nelson, who I later got to know, was a very, very sharp, smart man, and Weisinger I didn't really know. But whatever it was, I learned an awful lot from that critique. So he said, so the Weisinger letter said, "Why don't you try an 8-page Superboy story? I could really use something with Crypto the Superdog." So I went, okay. So I wrote an 8-page Crypto story and sent it back to him. And I got a letter back from Weisinger a couple weeks later saying, "This is really good. I want you to rewrite it and fix this, this, and this. But if you can't make it work, I can, so you've got a sale. Just send it back in and I'll pay you for it." And I went, great, terrific. I'm writing Superboy now. And I did the rewrite, sent it off, and never heard from Mort Weisinger again. I did hear that he was no longer the editor of Superboy, however, and he left the company shortly after. In the meantime, a man named Jack Miller was editing Deadman for DC. And I wrote this long critique into Mr. Miller on the first Deadman story, how much I liked it and where it should go. And it was and I wasn't angling for a job. I was just trying to connect with the people who did the comics and feel like I had some connection with them and that they had some sort of relationship with them beyond merely, mouth-breathing comic book reader. And Miller wrote back and said, "I've just taken on editing Wonder Woman and Metal Man. I could really use a new writer for Metal Man. Would you like to try a script?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "Send me some ideas for Wonder Woman also." So I wrote down some plots for Wonder Woman and wrote a short Metal Man story, sent them off to him, and then I got back a note from him saying, "Your material is wonderful. Unfortunately, I've been fired." So in the meantime, I had written some letters to Charlton Comics, where the editor was a man named Dick Giordano. And Dick Giordano was editing these Ghostly Tales and Mini Ghosts of Dr. Graves. And he wrote me and he said, "Hey, I really need scripts for these books. Write a Dr. Graves story for me. You're a clever writer. I can see what you're doing. You're writing, your letters are funny." So I wrote a story. I sent it to Giordano. I got back a letter. There's a pattern here. And his letter said, "Story's very good. Unfortunately, we're overbought at the moment. They've committed to a couple of other writers. I've got to use these other guys. So as soon as I have it, if you don't mind, I'll hold on to your script. And as soon as I have an opening, as soon as I'm allowed to buy it again, I'll buy it." And I wrote back to him and said, "That's great." And the next time I heard from Dick Giordano, he had taken Jack Miller's job at DC. And he was full up with writers. So I wasn't frustrated because I never said, "Well, I want to write for comic books." Because every interview I'd read of people in comic books said, you got to live in New York. And I didn't want to live in New York. I wasn't living in New York. I thought, okay, I'm not going to write comic books. I don't know why, but I didn't think to go up to the Western publishing offices and try to write comic books locally. There were, I knew they were there. For some reason, it just didn't dawn on me that I could submit to them. But so I had written this stuff for DC, kind of just for fun. And suddenly Jack Kirby's in LA and he's hiring me, and DC had come to me.
So the first ComicCon, because we are there now, chronologically.
Yeah.
Did you go to the first con?
I had been to every one.
Okay. Now you were a pro at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, most of the people, we're talking about, bridging the gap between fandom and being a pro. But you were a pro.
The first comic book convention of any kind I ever went to was the New York Con in July of 1970. Steve Sherman and Mike Royer and I went back together, my friend Mike, and we shared a hotel room at the Statler Hilton, and we went to this convention, and I met and that was also the first time I visited the DC offices and the Marvel offices and the Mad offices. I went out and spent a day with Steve Ditko and all these things. But I was Jack Kirby's assistant at that point, and I was, I think, starting to write the Disney comics at that point. So I never went to a comic book convention before I was writing comic books professionally, and I never had. I wish I had. I felt like I missed something.
Did Jack go to the first one?
Jack was the first. Yeah, Jack was
he was the guest.
He was the big guest.
The big guest.
The biggest event was Jack's Saturday afternoon talk.
So did you come with Jack?
No,
or you just came independent?
Steve Sherman, his brother Gary, and a friend of ours named Bruce Simon, who later did a lot of underground comics. The four of us drove down for the day. I was only there Saturday. We got up early in the morning. Steve picked me up at like 8 a.m. and we were in San Diego by 10:30, I think, or whatever. Maybe it was 7. Maybe we started at 7. Whatever it was, we were there early in the morning, and we stayed all day. And Jack had come down. I think Jack came down just for the day. I don't think he stayed over either. But at 2 o'clock, there was this Jack Kirby. It was the big event of the convention. Jack Kirby's giving a talk. And it wasn't even in a ballroom. It was kind of like in an open area that was like a big corridor. It was large enough to accommodate 150, 200 people. The whole convention only had like 300 or 400. And there was a little platform there, and they'd asked me to introduce Jack. And there was a fellow named Mark Hannerfeld there, who I had met at DC. Mark was an interesting guy. He was a comic book fan who later became an editor briefly at DC, or an assistant editor. And he was kind of hanging around the DC offices, doing stuff for them, publishing some fanzines on his own. But not he had functions at DC, but no job. They didn't pay him. He just was like we didn't use the term intern at that time. That's kind of what he was. And he had come out to San Diego Con on his own dime as DC's representative. He had family out here, but he went to the comic convention. He said to people at DC, you should have somebody representing you at the convention. And they went, okay, you go do it, and we're not going to pay you for it. So he came out to be the DC representative, paying his own way. And he had made a little talk at DC about DC and stuff like that. And he was good. He became a good friend of mine. And so they kept. So Jack says to Sheldorf, everybody knows Sheldorf, of course. Jack says to Sheldorf, "I want Mark to introduce me." And Shell thought he meant Mark Hannerfeld. So I'm standing there poised, ready to go up to do my big. And I was nervous about it. I had never really spoken to her in a crowd that way before. And I'm getting ready to do my big Jack Kirby introduction. I look up, and Mark Hannerfeld is suddenly up there introducing Jack. And I went, "Oh, good, I'm off the hook." And Jack gave his little talk. And it was just a wonderful afternoon, wonderful day. We drove back, and I thought, gee, I wish I could go tomorrow. And Steve didn't want to go back, drive down to San Diego again for another day. And that evening I called up and found out what it would cost. I checked what the airfare would be to fly back to San Diego for the day, and it was too much to do. And the schedule didn't work. I'd be paying a lot of money to be there 3 hours, But
so you're meeting all the founders, the guys who have put this together, who have come up from fandom. Did you know any of these guys?
I met Sheldorf when I was working at Marvel Mania around late July of 1970. Shell came by the office to try to get Marvel Mania to take a booth at the convention, and I met him there. The first time I met him, and he told us all about the convention he was going to do. He brought with him Shell used to do these field trips. Scott Shaw probably told you about these. He would call professionals and say, "Can I come see you on Saturday?" And they'd say, "Sure." He said, "Can I bring a few friends?" And he'd say, "Sure." And Shell would show up with 23 guys, literally. He did this to the Kirbys once or twice. They kept falling for it. This was Shell's way of kind of rallying the local comic fans behind him. I will take you to Forey Ackerman's house. I will take you to Jack Kirby's house, and things like that. So he had an expedition of these guys who went up to see Forey Ackerman's home, which at that time was over on Glendower near Olympic. You notice my geographical site on this is good.
You're drawing a map in my brain. Yes. I love it.
And afterwards, these guys who were all like the rank and file, some of the volunteers, some of the founders of the San Diego Con, they come over to Marvel Mania, and they're running around the office. And it was a Saturday, so I was running the office because the guy who really ran the company wasn't there. And I think Shell came back a couple of days later to meet him in person and try to get him to be an exhibitor and a supporter of the con. But that's when I met Shell for the first time. And then, 4 weeks later, we were at the convention. And it was just, and I've been to every San Diego Con ever since. Now Scott Shaw claims he's been to every single day of every con. I seem to remember Scott missing some, but I won't. He's my dear friend, so I don't question him. But I missed a few days here and there over the years.
In those
but I was at a day of every single convention.
Obviously, it bounced around to a couple of different locations.
Well, yeah. I mean, the first one was at the U.S. Grant. The second one was at the campus at UCSD. The third one, I think, was the El Cortez. Then I think they went to the Sheraton Harbor Island Inn for the fourth or fifth year. And they were all great. There was a period in the 80s when I got bored by them, and I suddenly started cutting back. That's when I started missing the first day intentionally and leaving early. And I had just gotten a little deja vu about it. And then it changed. I outgrew that. I had that couple of years when it was like, oh, well, I guess I got to go to this thing. And I'd have a good time while I was there, as long as I didn't stay too long. But there is nothing more boring in the world than signing your old work. And especially when I started working with Sergio, I had to sign everything he signed, and he signs everything. And I don't mind doing it for someone. If it pleases them, fine. But it's like, ooh, I hate myself if I got a thrill out of this. This is so tacky. But the conventions were a lot of fun. They were very party-like. Everyone knew everybody else. You got a chance to see everyone. If I went to a San Diego Con and Bob Clampett was there and Chuck Jones was there and Dawes Butler was there and Milton Caniff was there and Charles Schultz was there, I got to spend time with every one of those guys. There weren't so many guests. You could have a meal with each guest. There were only like 6 or 8 guests. And there was a party atmosphere. Everybody down by the pool at the El Cortez in the evenings. It just was great. The El Cortez was great because the people who ran the El Cortez didn't really care what you did to it. As long as they could check people into rooms after you left, you could write on the walls, you could run screaming through the hallways. It didn't matter. There was one year, I think this was like the second or third year they were at the El Cortez. I'm going to tell you a secret of the ComicCon. No one knows but me. I'm going to reveal it here. They announced the dates of the convention. And then 2 weeks later, they moved them. They said, oh, put out a press release. Instead of this weekend, it's going to be the following weekend. So I was curious, as I would be, why did they move it? It turned out the reason they moved it, Shell insisted on moving it, because he found out that the same year, if he had the original dates, we would have had to share the hotel on Saturday with an event. And the event was the Miss Nude California pageant. And Shell thought, oh, we can't have children there when there's nude people in the building. So they moved it to another date. And I thought, Shell just missed the chance to have the greatest comic convention ever. And this was back when, like, the women at comic conventions were Mrs. Jack Kirby and June Foray, and that's it. This is when there were no women at these things. These were practically like YMCA meetings, But the El Cortez was fun, and it didn't have much to do with the business. It was kind of like a party with people of like interest. The panels were fun. Nobody was selling anything. There was not the sense of promotion. Now, you know, at the cons nowadays, I do a bunch of panels, a lot of panels, and there's several that are recurring. One of the things is every year on Saturday morning, they give me a 3,000 seat room. We play this quick draw game that Sergio and I developed, cartooning. And then after that, I usually do a panel with cartoon voice actors. Again, 3,000 seat room. I do another cartoon voice panel the next day. And I have some of the only panels, there aren't too many other ones, events, in a big room that's not about somebody selling something. They're not extensions of the fact that someone's promoting a movie down in the exhibitor hall and they have a panel, or that they're promoting a new comic book and they have a panel, or you know, they're launching a new movie or a TV show. I like the idea that my panels are always non-mercenary. I mean, people plug what they're working on, but the panel does not exist because somebody thinks, oh, we've got to promote our product. And back when I was at this early San Diego cons, they were all like that. They were all like the joy of doing it, the joy of, let's just have fun talking about comics. And I got to interview a lot of fun people and be on a lot of panels, and the panels mattered a lot. There was the masquerade. The masquerade was something everybody went to because there was nothing else to do, opposite it. There was a banquet with dreadful food and terrible speeches, and everybody went to that. I keep thinking of stories around the pool. There was one night, maybe Scott told you this or someone else did, when they had a midnight showing of the movie Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. Anybody tell you about this? Well, I don't know if you know the movie Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. If you watch that movie on DVD or see it alone in a theater on TV, it's really boring. If you see it with an audience, a hip audience, it's hysterical.
Roger Ebert?
Roger Ebert co-wrote it with Russ Meyer, who directed it. And it is really, it's a deadpan, very funny parody that's so deadpan, you can't get that it's a parody until you hear other people laughing at it. You can't get all the jokes until you realize it's a great participatory experience. So they ran it at midnight at the El Cortez, and it's about an hour and 45-minute movie. And an hour and 20 minutes into it, the fire alarm starts going off. The fire alarms go crazy. They're so loud you can't even hear the movie. They shut down the movie, and we all go out, and we see, you know, different people. Everybody's coming out. It's 2:30 in the morning now, and there's people coming out of different rooms on the balconies, sometimes even their own in their underwear and things like that. It must have taken the hotel 45 minutes to get that alarm shut off so people could go back to sleep. And they never finished running the movie. The next day I did a panel, and I said, okay, before we start, folks, here's how Beyond the Valley of the Doll ends. And I told the ending of it. But all through the movie, I was sitting with Bob Clampett, a lovely man. We all know Bob Clampett. And Bob didn't get it. And I was sitting there explaining to him the movie. I was like, oh, she's a lesbian. And oh no, he's actually a transvestite. She, you know, and things like that. He didn't understand the movie. It was so, and it's like, where else could that happen? At the San Diego Con. Where else? And things kept happening at San Diego Cons that were kind of miraculous, with people meeting other people. 77 or 76, Dawes Butler came. Dawes Butler, the great cartoon voice actor, the voice of Yogi Bear and Huckleberry Hound, and hundreds of others. I later became very close friends with Dawes. I knew him fairly well then. And he was a lovely, wonderful man. I've met a few great creative geniuses in my life who were also very, very nice men. And Jack Kirby was one, and Dawes Butler was on the same level in terms of this greatness and this compassion for people. And Dawes had done the TV show Time for Beanie, created by Bob Clampett. And that experience had ended badly. They threatened to sue each other, and they hated each other. And for the first 2 days, and now they're both at the San Diego Con. First time they've been in the same location since Dawes walked out on the Time for Beanie show in 1954. And for the first 2 or 3 days, they're avoiding each other. They literally, like, they'd see one coming and they walk the other way, and like that. You could see it. You could sense the dynamic. And I talked to Dawes and I talked to Bob, and they both knew what they were doing. And finally, Dawes comes up to me the last day of the con, and he says, "This is stupid. Would you arrange for me to get together with Clampett?" So I went over to Clampett, and I said, "There's a young man over here who wants to do cartoon voices. Could you talk to him for a minute and give him some pointers?" And Bob said, "Sure, bring him over." And I brought Dawes over, and Bob did one of these takes, like one of like Daffy Duck in the Great Piggy Bank Robbery. And then when he saw Dawes extending his hand in friendship, it was just this wonderful moment. The two of them embraced, and they spent an hour talking about, hey, remember this guy? Remember that time that the cameraman was drunk and things like that. And it was one of those I wish I had a tape recorder moments. And I have a photo of the two of them together, arm around each other. It's the only picture ever taken of the two of them together like that after, 54 when Dawes quit the show. Things like that happened at those. I guess they still happen to some extent, but the convention was more about those moments back then. They were about one-on-ones. They were about having lunch with people you always want to meet, or seeing friends more. The years at the El Cortez, there was a Denny's down the street, which was about the only place to eat. It was the only place within walking distance, and the parking at the El Cortez was so terrible that once you parked your car there, you were afraid to take it out and go somewhere else. So we just ate at the Denny's. I ate every meal at the Denny's. And you go down to the Denny's, and it was like an adjunct to the convention. It was 3 blocks away. You walk down the hill, and half the convention was there. And I have as many stories about that Denny's as I do about what happened at the El Cortez.
It's funny, when I was talking to Scott, I said, we keep talking about San Diego and San Diego Con, but San Diego was very different in 1970 than it is now. It was a much smaller town. Yeah. And demographically, to be in during the Vietnam War and be, a Navy town and whatever, this is a different San Diego than the one that we have the con in now.
Oh yeah, it's very different. We went to, there was a transitional period when the convention expanded out of the El Cortez and it was into the convention center, the old convention center. And we were staying at a couple different hotels around the Executive and the Westgate and a few of those. And they would have the banquet, the award ceremony. It wasn't even the Eisner's then, it was the Inkpot Award ceremony at the Hotel San Diego. So we'd get a little dressed up to go there and we'd be at our hotel, and a bunch of us, we'd all walk through this part of San Diego that was like hookers and massage parlors and tattoo parlors, and right across from the Hotel San Diego was the Institute of Hypnosis. The sign, come to the Institute of the premise, I think, was, we will teach you how to hypnotize women into being your sex slaves. And we'd all just go over and take the course, and tell us, no, you go over and take the course. and we were at this. So one of the amazing things to me is seeing how the redevelopment of San Diego has gotten rid of that. The Institute of Hypnosexism is not there. I think it's now the Mormon Church. But anyway, it's not there anymore. The massage parlors aren't there. The tattoo parlors aren't there, and it's not like a Navy town the way it used to be. And now you've got these Marriotts and Hiltons and Hard Rock cafes have sprung up around this new convention center. And the new convention center is built on the principle of the San Diego Con. The San Diego Con showed them how to rebrand San Diego as a convention city, and it flourished. It's one of those amazing legacies. And the only person who saw it coming was Jack Kirby. Jack predicted it, and everybody went, Jack, come on. Yeah, tell us about Asgard again. But it's just stunning to me. And we now go and we take over the city. And I always love when I drive to the San Diego Con. I'm driving along, and all of a sudden, I'm still a mile from the convention, and there's the convention. There's posters in every window welcoming the con. There's people with the badges on. There's people with the big, giant loot bags walking around. And we're not just at that convention center or the hotels around it. We have a mile radius is us, and it's all our city. And people assume that if you walk into any restaurant that you're with the con. I take my badge off. People still saying, "How's the convention for you?" And every cab driver I have down there says to me, "Oh, I wish I could go to the convention." And
you hear that.
yeah.
I was going to ask you, you mentioned us, the larger us as the community. Back then, it was a smaller community. Was that defining yourselves as us? I mean, it meant something. It meant something different then.
Well, yeah, I mean, we were, right now, every person in the world can tell you that Tony Stark is Iron Man. Back then, we were the only ones who knew that Tony Stark was Iron Man. Only if you bought the comic book did you know that stuff. And there was a certain, not that the comic book sold better then, I don't quite figure that out, but there was a certain feeling of, I mean, there can be a joy to belonging to a cult. And you wish, gee, I wish the whole world knew this wonderful stuff that I have. And now some of us are learning the downsides of the whole world knowing our stuff. Not the least of which is that we go to our comic convention, and it isn't about comics anymore, as much as it used to be. Comics are still the underpinning, but comic books have been redefined. A movie that's got comic book feeling on it is comics. Animation that has the feeling of a Jack Kirby show is comics. We've now expanded the definition of comics way beyond what's on paper.
Now, you mentioned your collection. You mentioned how extraordinarily the largest collection is. Did it start with just buying whatever you wanted when you were a kid?
Yes.
And extend. So when you become a professional, now you've got a double life. You're a creator, but you're also a collector.
Right.
How has that evolved? What are you doing?
Well, the most important thing, and the key thing about becoming a professional is free comics. At one point, I do all the Garfield stuff, and I do a lot of Garfield things. And at one point, I was at this Garfield merchandising convention, and I met the man who was the president of the Pez Candy Company, because they were doing Garfield Pez dispensers. And I slobbered over him. I told him how much I used to love Pez and things like that. He said, "Oh, you want Pez? Sure. Give me your address. I'll send you Pez." So I was getting free Pez. And I go to my mailbox one day. I opened up the box, and there's a crate of Pez, the 4 new Pez dispensers of the month, and a whole bunch of refills. And he gave me mostly orange, which is one I liked. And then there's the box from DC of all the new DCs for the month, and there's a box of Dark Horse of all the new Dark Horses for the month. And I think, get your comics for nothing, get your Pez for free. There it is. It's kind of the wish dream of when I was 10, and that's very powerful. I don't eat Pez anymore, and I don't buy all the new comics. but there's these looking glass moments you have, and you get a lot of them at the ComicCon. You go, my God, I'm talking to the guy whose work I loved, or I'm working with the guy whose work I loved when I was a kid. I have this in my career. My whole career is about, now I'm working with that guy whose work I loved. I mentioned earlier it's a mad, 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 mad world, my favorite movie. I've worked with almost everybody in that movie who was alive that I could have worked with. I worked with Jonathan Winters. I worked with Jerry Lewis. I worked with Sid Caesar. I worked with Buddy Hackett. I mean, every time I'm conscious of the fact that's the guy from It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. I went to see it 2 weeks ago. They ran it at the Cinerama Dome in Hollywood, which is where it debuted. And I've seen the movie 50 times, but the last time I had seen it at the Cinerama Dome before last week was 2 days after Kennedy was shot. The first time I saw it was at the Cinerama Dome, and this is the first time I've been back to the Cinerama Dome to see it again. And I just thought, oh, that's amazing, just to button that arc in my life.
Now you mentioned also that all the panels have kind of shifted away from comics, and your panels are still about the art.
Pretty much,
quick draw.
Yeah.
Scott's Oddball is another
Scott's,
one. Those are very popular panels.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons they're popular is that they're about people and not about merchandise. People go to see Scott because Scott is so brilliant at what he does. Don't show him this part of the tape. Scott is so damn clever. He's clever on paper too, but he's clever in the Oddball comics, and the passion comes out. I would ordinarily hate a panel that was about, look how stupid this comic was. And I don't like a lot of times when people do let's do these bad movie festivals and make fun of how stupid these movies are. I don't like that. But Scott's is so loving and so vested in love of the form that I think it's amazing.
When did you first start doing panels? I mean, did you approach them? Did they approach you?
I think what it was that the first few San Diego cons I went to, I told you I didn't introduce Jack at the first one. I think starting with the second one, there was this idea. See, in the first 10 years of not just the San Diego Con, but all Comic-Cons, here was the programming. Let's say at 2 o'clock, let's have a writer's panel. Say, somebody do a writer's panel. 3 o'clock, let's do an artist panel. Hey, somebody do an artist panel. At the 75 or 76 New York Con, I did a writer's panel. And all it was the Phil Suling ran the convention, went to Mike Friedrich, a friend of his, and said, Mike, will you do a writer's panel at 2 o'clock? And Mike just went around and said, hey, would you be in the writer's panel? Would you be in the writer's panel? And we were the writer's panel. There was no program book saying who was on the writer's panel because we were picked by who was not at lunch at that moment. So at the early San Diego Cons, they kept having this thing called the writer's panel. And it was the same panel every one. Every writer's panel was the same thing. We would somehow start talking about how fun it was to write comics, and someone would say, why don't you do comics like this? And we'd say, well, here's how the marketplace is. And then we'd turn into panels about distribution and cowardly publishers. And we just talk about distribution and cowardly publishers. But I did that panel 20 times at the early conventions. At every San Diego Con, there was a writer's panel, and they stuck me on it. And they would do, I think I remember the year it was at the Sheraton on Harbor Island Inn. I think it was just Mike Friedrich and I were the writers panel. And then we did 1 year. It was 1 year at El Cortez when Marv Wolfman and I were the writers panel, because somebody felt we had to have a writers panel, and I was a writer.
So when did you develop Quick Draw?
Quick Draw was developed actually at WonderCon. Gary Sassaman, who was then the programming director for both WonderCon and San Diego Comic-Con International, came to me and said, have you ever thought of developing something with Sergio, the two of you? Sergio and I had a stunt we did. We started developing, we were doing group panels. Once we started doing group, we always would have a group panel. Sometimes we called them the Mark and Sergio show. And we did this thing, did it about maybe a half dozen times, probably a dozen times at different conventions, half dozen times at Comic-Con. We would create a group page in front of the audience in 6 minutes, 5 minutes. We would take a big 6-foot foam core board, and rule off 6 panels on it. And Sergio is a very fast artist. I am a very fast writer, and I also letter very well. And to further complicate matters, we would do the last panel upside down. We would do panel 1, panel 2, and we would take a suggestion from the audience. You know, what's Gru doing? Somebody says, Gru is looking for his underwear. Fine, Gru's looking for his underwear. And Sergio would start drawing panel 1 while I was writing a balloon in panel 2, and then he'd be drawing the picture to go with the balloon in panel 2 while I was doing panel 4. And then we'd go back and we'd do 3. We'd be climbing over each other. And then we'd get to the bottom of it, we would turn the page upside down and do the last panel upside down, because I can letter upside down and Sergio can draw upside down. So we'd be doing the last panel upside down so that it was pretty much complete before the audience knew what it was. We could turn it around and there's the punchline. They couldn't read it upside down. The audience couldn't really read it upside down, but we could turn it over and there's the punchline. So we did this. We did it in 6 minutes. We would do a page of Gru. And Gary said to us, he guys thought of developing a whole panel around the idea of creating something in front of the audience. And so we did Quick Draw 1 year at I had taught improv comedy for a while, a little bit. And improv comedy invariably comes down to games. You have these things. There's a tradition of a woman named Viola Spolin started in improv comedy, the Spolin games. They're challenges to create a scene in front of the audience. Well, so I just kind of took that and adapted improv games to what if you took improv games and made cartoonists do them. And we did some trial and error. We tried some things which never worked, but we developed a repertory of games to play and ways to do this stuff. And we learned how to do it, and it just gets, it used to be that they would say to me each year, we're going to do Quick Draw, Mark, but we've got to get a superstar artist on the panel to fill the room. You've got to come up with somebody. The first guy would be Sergio, the second guy would be Scott Shaw, and then we had to have the third guy be somebody who had a name. And so we'd have to go around, and this is difficult because the guys who are famous are not necessarily people who could draw fast. But we'd find someone who fit, and we'd do this. We'd fill the room. And Quick Draw 1 year turned away so many people. They came to me and said, you don't need a name, just do Quick Draw. So now they don't care who the third guy is, and I just pick somebody I think will be funny. Now,
you mentioned that you like the purity of it being about comics. But you've been a television writer for a very long time
Yeah.
now. I mean, was going to cons then an escape from what you were actually doing, or did you still feel very much a part of that world and that's where you wanted to be?
I feel I'm a writer, and I just write stuff. I write TV shows, I write comic books, I write cartoons. Sometimes the lines are blurred. I'm right now writing the Garfield. This very day, I am writing for the Garfield comic book and the Garfield TV show. And if I come up with an idea, I might use it in either. Or I might write a joke in one of them and also duplicate it in the other. There's not a huge difference for me. You don't need to do that line of demarcation. The margins of the page are different. The people I deal with that hand it in may be different, but it's still the part of me that matters is the same. It's me thinking of silly jokes and silly stories, and it doesn't matter where they go. So there's another one of those little seminal life-changing moments. Years ago at UCLA, they showed, now here's one of those cross references, Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. They showed it up at UCLA. They brought in everybody alive who'd worked in the movie, including Roger Ebert and Russ Meyer. And I took my friend Carol Lay, cartoonist Carol Lay, most people have seen this one of Carol, went to see it. And there was this panel discussion. Roger Ebert was talking, as he used to do. And he was talking about Russ Meyer, the filmmaker, and he said, one of the things that impressed him about Russ was that, he said, Russ lives his life all in one room. He doesn't have, you go to a party at his house, and there's the women who are with the huge breasts who are in his movie, and there's his old army buddies. And there's all his friends know all of his other friends. And I was sitting there going, gee, I need to do that. Because I had all my friends from the comic book business, and all my friends from the TV business, and all my friends from the animation business. And there was some interaction there, but I had a tendency, if I had a gathering, or to kind of I was like, oh, there were separate groups, like I was living 3 different identities. And I thought, well, everybody should know everybody else. And from that moment on, I made an effort to include people in dinner parties or events and things like that without any and then the ComicCon becomes an equalizer that way, because they're all there. I go to the ComicCon, and my friends from the animation business are there, and my friends from the TV business. At San Diego, year before last, I introduced on the cartoon voice panel. I introduced Sid and Marty Krofft, take a bow, and Joe Ruby and Ken Spears, who I worked for in animation. So here's producers I worked for in animation, and persons I worked for in live action, and they're on the panel at the Comic-Con. And all of a sudden, all these worlds have come together and merged from my viewpoint. There's no line of demarcation between them. So am I answering your question? I mean,
yeah, absolutely. I your panels, you like the purity of the comic art, but you were in the television world, so obviously growing up, I mean, you're enamored of these comedians. You're talking about these guys who influenced you. Obviously, have informed what you're writing outside of your favorites in the comic book.
Yeah, but I don't see the lines of division anymore. They've got so blurry that if I right now said I'm going to have 3 different parties, one for my comic book people, one for my animation people, one for my live action TV people, I couldn't draw those lines anymore. They're too blurry. This year at the Comic-Con, the cartoon voice panel, at the end of it, I introduced Stan Freberg to come out and join the panel. Stan Freberg was my hero when I was 9, and now he's on Garfield. I'm his director. I remember as a kid becoming aware of who June Foray was. June Foray was the voice of Rocky the Flying Squirrel and Natasha, and I just loved all these things June Foray was on, including Stan Freberg records. A couple of months ago, I got to take, June is on the Garfield show, I direct her on that, and a couple weeks ago, I got to take her to the Daytime Emmy Awards and walk her up on stage when she won her first Emmy at the age of 94. 94-year-old woman won an Emmy, her first Emmy, beating out that bitch Betty White by 5 years. So
what did you win the Emmy for?
Being on the Garfield show. Her role. I mean, she won it for being June Foray.
Yeah.
The second award was for her role. She plays this character in Mrs. Cauldron on the Garfield show, which I created for her. And I wanted to have June on the show. She does great witches. I wrote a witch part for her, and she won an Emmy for it.
So the people in the early cons, the people who are putting together this thing and bringing back, the memory of the El Cortez. When you first meet these guys, is it like these are my brothers down in San Diego? This is something, or had you
When I
known
first
them?
met, no, I met Scott Shaw at Jack Kirby's house on one of Shell's field trips. I met Shell when he came to the Marl Mini office. I met some of these other guys, Richard Elf and Mike Towery and Barry Alfonso. Yeah, and John Pound and all these guys. I met mostly at Jack Kirby's house or at the early San Diego cons. I didn't really know them before they started the convention. I just met them while they were organizing it. And Scott became one of my closest friends. He moved in with me, in fact, at one point. And it was frightening. It was like The Odd Couple, but with 2 Oscars and no Felix. There's not a lot of separation of these things for me in my mind. They're just guys I like, people I know.
Have we missed any of the big? You said there were 3 or 4 life-changing points.
Oh, there's a whole bunch of them. There's a whole bunch
have we
of them.
missed a big one in the evolution of what we're talking about? Because I know we talked about some of these serendipitous meetings where things just took a radical. I mean, besides meeting Laura Petrie in color.
Yeah,
which I totally understand. I'm with you on that.
Yeah. There's been a bunch of them actually. There's personal ones here where I suddenly realized something about myself. But I mean, in terms of comics and things like that, yeah. This is way too long a story to tell in detail. But around 1987 or 6 or 7, about the time I was getting fed up with the ComicCon. I wasn't getting fed up with it. I always loved the ComicCon, but I would come down to the convention around 86 or something like that, and I'd be there. I feel like I'm in San Diego now, but I would be there for a day and a half, and I'd suddenly go, "Why am I here?" I would have met everybody I could meet I hadn't met before. I would have done my panel or 2. I was doing like 2 panels at the time. I would have done my 2 panels, and now I'm in San Diego. I'm far from my home and my typewriter or word processor, whatever I had at the moment, and I have no reason to be here. And I was very conscious. I had friends who were into comics who were very conscious of celebrity. Are we celebrities? Are we stars at this? How do you conduct yourself as a star at these conventions? I had a friend who was coming to the convention, and he was very angry at where his table was because he hadn't been asked enough for his autograph. And I thought, gee, this man is very different from me. I was very conscious of that. And I suddenly said to myself, this doesn't matter. And the whole series of events, and I can't list them all for you because they're very internecking, difficult stories. But I suddenly thought to myself, it doesn't matter. Just show up and have fun. Stop worrying about being a professional. Stop worrying about getting your next job there. I never worried that much about getting jobs at conventions. But I sometimes come with conventions with a list of I've got to talk to this editor and see if I can do an issue of that. I got to talk to this editor about it. I got to talk to this guy about this. And I said, forget about that. Don't go to the convention for work. But don't go to the convention for play. Go to the convention to be part of the convention, to contribute to the convention and have a good time contributing to the convention. Because the convention is a wonderful entity. I look around it and I see so many wonderful things happening and people having such a good time. And I feel like I am making a contribution. It's microscopic in terms of the convention. If I didn't make my contribution, no one would notice. Oh, well, there's no quick draw this year, we'll go to this panel. I mean, whatever it is. But I thought to myself, don't fight it. Don't surrender to it. Just enjoy it. And go there and have fun. And if people want you to sign stuff, you sign stuff. And if people don't want you to sign stuff, fine. And if people want to talk to you, great, you talk to them. And if people want you on a panel, you do the panel. And just go along and just contribute to this thing because the convention is such a neat thing. Something that people don't realize. My girlfriend Carolyn, a couple of years ago, wanted to bring some friends of hers out to see the convention. And there were people who did not read comics. They did not really read science fiction. They had little interest in them. But she wanted them to see the convention for the sake of the convention. I thought at first, what would they be interested in? They don't know who Herb Trimpe is. They don't know who the Batman villains are or whatever. They want to see your panels. Well, my panel at 2 o'clock is about old Batman villains. They don't never read Batman. And they went to the convention. They had a great time. And I asked them afterwards, what was it that appealed to you about this? And they said, it was just so neat being around all those people who'd made something. And if you start thinking about the convention in that context, yeah, every place you turn, somebody's painted a picture, written a book. I mean, this is apart from the comic book dealers who are selling old stuff, who obviously have their purpose at the convention and function. We love them. But the rest of the convention, the part that isn't about selling old comics, is all these people who are selling a book they self-published, or they're promoting a new video game, or they're showing their new animation or their software or whatever. And every place you look, somebody has invented something or made something. And there's something very exhilarating about being around that. And when people complain that the aisles are crowded and it's hard to get across the room and the place is too packed, I go, great, I love that. I mean, admittedly I have advantages because I'm 6'3", I'm really good at getting places I want. I got all these badges saying I'm important, and people part for me for that. So I don't have as much problem as other people getting around. But even then, it can be a pain. But I like that. I like the crowds. I like the enthusiasm. For 5 days a year, I can put up with being around people because they love this stuff. And it's like, to use a term we used in the 60s that I hated then, I hate now, a contact high. It's to be around all this excitement and fun and people having a great time. And I learned to embrace that. I learned to kind of get out of thinking, how's this going to benefit me? And what's my role here? And how important am I? Or how am I not important? Or should I be on this panel? Or should there was one year, here's a stupid thing I did. At one of the 4th or 5th cons, I think, they give me my badge. And it doesn't say professional. At that time, the badges said your name, professional. If you were a professional. My badge was supposed to always say professional. I was always professional. My badge didn't say professional. So I'm walking around, didn't notice it. And another writer comes up to another comic book guy and says, why doesn't it say professional on your badge? I said, I guess they left it off. And he goes, no, you've got to go say professional on it. You're being demeaned. I am? And I go, yeah, yes, you're a professional. And goddamn it, you have to assert yourself you're a professional. You got to tell the whole world you're professional. You're being insulted by this convention. I went, I guess. I let him talk me into this. I went back to the people making the badges who were beleaguered. They were behind, and there was a huge line. I go, excuse me, could you remake my badge so it was professional? And I go, oh. And they tried to get me to go away, like, that's not important. I went, well, I think I'm supposed to have a professional badge. And they go, and I basically ended up standing there for 45 minutes till they figured out I wasn't going away. And they finally took them on and made me a professional badge. And I got my professional badge, and I went back, and I felt so stupid. I thought to myself, why did I do that? I was 22 at the time, or whatever it was. We do a lot of stupid. I do enough stupid stuff now, but I thought to myself, and I finally came to the point in like the mid '80s. I said, just love the convention, just go with it. Just don't complain about it. Don't fight it. Don't worry about your role in it. Don't worry about whether you're making any money there. Don't worry about if you're getting, if people know who you are. Just make it work for you. And I started really enjoying the convention after that. I wouldn't let them. I've learned not to let them give me a table. Every convention I go to, they say, "We'll give you a table. You can sign it." I don't want a table. I don't want a table. Don't give me a table. And I walk in and they've got a table for me. And I go, I didn't want a table. And they said, well, just leave it there. No. Take my name off the table. I'm not going to sit behind it. I'm going to go around and enjoy the convention and experience it. There were a couple of times. There was one time Sergio and I were talked into going to Seattle to a one-day Sunday convention. And we go to the airport. I meet Sergio at the airport Saturday night. We fly up to Seattle. A guy picks us up at the airport, takes us to the hotel. Like we got there about 10 o'clock. And I had scripts to write, and Sergio had group pages to draw. So I went, okay, see you in the morning, Sergio. Meet you at 9 o'clock. Go back in and write stuff that I could have written at home, and it would have been more convenient to write it at home. Get up the next morning, get all showered and cleaned up, and look as good as I can look. Needs a lot of help. I go down to the coffee shop. I meet Sergio. We have breakfast. The guy comes in, takes us to the convention, to this little like Armory, whatever it was. And he walks us in, and the convention is opening at 11, and this is about 10:30. And we get to this table, Mark and Sergio, and there's a line already of dealers. There's an hour-long line to have Grooves signed. And it's what it is essentially is every dealer in the Midwest is bringing every unsold Groove comic he's got, because they'll sell better with autographs on them. Some of them are there with hand trucks with hundreds of copies. And we sat there all day, sign Groove, sign Groove, sign Groove. If Sergio would sign them, I'd sign them. Sergio would sign them, I'd sign them. And I signed, other comics I'd done, Black Hawk stuff and New God stuff, and things like that. Didn't have time to talk to anybody. And at 4 o'clock, they come over and say, okay, time to go to the airport. And I went, I didn't see the convention. I look around, and the convention is gone. The convention closed at 3:30, and the dealers have already folded up. The convention has ended. And I didn't see the convention. I didn't see Seattle. They brought us Burger King in the middle of the day. And we got in the car, and we drive to the airport. And I'm sitting there, Sergio, why did we just do that? I mean, it's fine to support your product, but we were signing Grooves that people had already bought.
Right.
And I said, let's not do that again. I just wasted 24 hours of my life. If I could have talked to people, if I'd signed 1/3 as many comics and spent the rest of the day chatting with people and answering their questions or getting advice or looking at portfolios, that would have been great. But I learned not to do that. That helped me a lot. Because I don't really care about the commerce. I never sell anything at conventions. When my book on Jack Kirby was out, everybody kept saying, where's your table? I want to buy a copy. I go, I'm not selling it. Go buy it from somebody else and I'll sign it for you. I don't want to sell stuff. I don't like sitting at a table. I don't like selling. I don't want to make change. I am a writer, and that's all I do. I'm not a bookseller. It's enough to be a writer. I mean, if I can manage that, I'm doing okay. I can't learn another trade. So the San Diego Con, the seminal event for me was I realized just enjoy the convention. It was like a revelation that came to me saying, it's simple. Just go and have fun.
Yeah, I was going to wrap up with what I did with Scott, was just throw out some names of the early organizers and just have a reminiscence.
Go.
Sheldorf.
I
didn't throw that name at Scott.
You got another hour and a half?
I didn't throw that name at Scott.
I liked Shell tremendously. I fought with Shell. I had frustrations with Shell. Anyone watching this will understand the phrase, I love the guy, but there were times I wanted to deck him. I knew Shell. I met Shell in August of 1970. There were periods of time there when Shell became very reclusive after he kind of withdrew from the convention, when the only contacts he had with the convention were through a guy named Bob Harvey and me. And the convention would come to me and say, can you talk to Shell about this? Can you be the go-between to try to solve this rift between us? Shell was a guy who loved comics. He loved comics so much, he worshipped Milton Caniff and Jack Kirby especially, but anybody who ever drew a comic. A certain part of his frustration, and if you'd mentioned him to Scott Shaw, you would have heard this, is that Shell had to sit and watch as kids, people he met as kids, became professional cartoonists. And Scott was probably the one that bugged him the most, because Scott became a very established professional cartoonist, a very good professional cartoonist, but also a guy who really was a cartoonist. There's people who draw cartoons for a living, and there are people who are cartoonists. Scott is a cartoonist, and I don't even think it was envy. It was that kind of like, wait a minute, for Shell. There's Dave Stevens is now. I remember him when he was a little kid who couldn't draw anything. I remember Scott and all these other guys. He didn't feel that way towards me because I was already professional kind of when he met me. But he remembered Scott and Dave and a couple of those other guys when they were just walking around the little portfolio saying, gee, Mr. Dorff, could you tell us how we can get into comics? And he resented the fact that they had gotten in and he was still an outsider. Shell couldn't really write, he couldn't really draw. He could somehow letter at times. He had a very great value as an enthusiastic fan. He got credit for a lot of things in the San Diego Con he didn't do, because other people were doing the heavy lifting. But the thing that Shell did contribute was that he was he was the public face of the love of comics. He was the guy who made the San Diego Con as benevolent an organization as it is. If the con had been headed up, the exact same con had been headed up by a guy who also sold comics like a dealer, it would have been a very different entity. If it had been headed by a guy who looked like a businessman, or a guy who wanted to be a tycoon of a Donald Trump of the comic convention industry, and you've seen a few of those guys around, it would have been a very different entity from the start. It might have succeeded, but it would have been a different convention. Shell was the guy who looked at him and went, this is out of love of comics. He didn't do a lot of the heavy lifting. He let other people do that for him. And that kind of is why he ended up getting excluded from a lot of it, because if you want to have a role in something, you got to show up, you got to work. And he didn't work very much. But we went through, I got 150 Sheldorf stories. And they're basically all about this guy trying to figure out who he was in comics, because he wasn't a writer and he wasn't an artist. He was a letterer for Milton Caniff for a while, which is not a position that gives you an identity in nobody lines up at comics conventions to get the autograph of the letterer of Steve Canyon. And I felt very bad about how he ended. I saw him about a month before he died. He was in this terrible hospital facility. And the last day of I stayed over the day after the convention. And on Monday morning, while my girlfriend was packing the room up, I drove out to the hospital to try to talk to him. And I had to scrub up and hand sanitize and scrub up like I was going to perform surgery on him and put a mask on. I walked in the room. I said, Shell, it's Mark Evanier. And he didn't remember. He was out of it. And this male nurse who was attending to him said, "Oh yeah, you were the guy doing quick draw. It was great. I saw it the other day." And I thought, oh, something very surreal here. I'm part of the con and Shell isn't. And he was this person who was so responsible. He was not wholly responsible. And the attention he got sapped some of the attention that should have gone to Ken Kruger and Mike Towery and Richard Alf. And I shouldn't start naming names because now I'll leave somebody out and commit the same sin. But there were a whole bunch of guys, Richard Butner, and all these guys who made the convention work when it was not a profitable thing for them, when they couldn't draw much of a salary, if anything, when it was just being done for they wanted to make this thing happen. And I feel enormously mixed things about Sheldorf. I don't like telling Sheldorf stories sometimes because it's hard to. The funny ones don't make him look very good, and I don't want to make him look bad because I really respected what he contributed. But some of the funny stories aren't pretty funny. You got another name?
How about Richard Alf, since you just mentioned him?
Richard, I didn't know that well. I just talked to him at conventions. Richard seemed like a very happy guy who just, we all know how he put up the money to see the early ones, and he'd go to the convention, and it was kind of like a joy on Richard's face. Even when they were big conventions, he had nothing to do with them. He just looked around with a certain pride. If he resented anything about lack of reward or recognition, he never showed it. When I saw him, he was always very positive about, wow, this is a great thing, and I'm partly responsible for it happening. And I like that about him. I didn't know him. I probably in my life spent, I saw him at Jack Kirby's house for once in 1970, and I saw him for 5 minutes at a couple of conventions.
How about Ken Kruger?
Ken Kruger is a guy who has, I'll tell you a Ken Kruger story. The year they were at the Harbor Island Inn, right in the middle of the day, you're looking like we're out of time here.
No, I was just making sure.
Okay.
We're okay.
I'll stop whenever you tell me to.
No, go right ahead.
Ken Kruger, is in the middle of the afternoon, and all of a sudden, some kid walks up. There's a dealer who's got Action 1 and Detective 27 and Batman 1. This is back when there were a lot of those around. And they were like going for $300 or $500, whatever. And we went, wow, $500. Today, the Mylar envelope is $500. So this kid just grabs up a bunch of them off the table and just runs for the door. And somebody yells, "Stop that guy, he's a rip-off artist," which I thought was giving him a lot of dignity. I mean, you went on and insult the guy by calling him a thief. And as he's running through the dealer's room, a couple of us, I was one of them, we body checked him. I just slammed into him. I just threw my elbow out and slammed into him. And he did like broken field running like O.J. Simpson, you know, except he didn't stop to knife anybody. And they caught him by the door. 2 security guards grabbed him. And I went over there, and there's this whole, what are we going to do? Everybody's going to go, hey, we got him. The dealer runs up and grabs his comics back. And what do we do with them? And Ken Kruger walks up and says, call the police. And everybody goes, the police? And he goes, yes, this is a crime. This is a crime, the kind of thing people go to jail for. That's $1,200 worth of comic books or $1,500 worth of comic books. If the kid grabbed $1,500 in cash, we'd call the police. Call the damn police. Or I'll do it. And somebody called the police, and the police came over and arrested the guy. And dealers were walking around like that was amazing. Like Ken had invented something. Because I had seen conventions before where they'd catch thieves. There was theft at conventions, and they would catch the guy, and they'd say, don't come, you're banned from our convention, and let him go, and usually he'd keep the stuff. You know, there was a kid at one of the conventions at downtown LA, one of the witchcraft and science fantasy conventions they used to have, and one day he went in and he was like smuggling stuff out in his pants, and about the 5th trip they caught him. He was hiding it out someplace, coming back for more, and they caught him and they took the stuff and said, now don't you ever come back to our conventions, and they threw him out, and the police came and took this kid away, and the kid was like, what? For stealing comic books? And I realized that Ken was the grown-up. He was the only grown-up in the room. And throughout the early conventions, that's what his role was. He was the guy who people called him a father figure. In some cases he was, but he was also an adult figure. He was a guy who said, this is a business, this is money. I will bet you, I know this for a fact, I'll bet you Ken was the first guy to say, we got to make sure we have insurance. We've got to make sure we're indemnified against this. We got to make sure the hotel, you know, doesn't do this. Who understood that it wasn't just let's have fun and put on a party, guys. Or everybody loves everybody else. Who brought the reality of life into it. And Ken is a good man, and I liked him a lot.